Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. Last spring, the pandemic and the related lockdown measures rocked our state's already fragile economy. And nearly 1 in 5 private sector jobs disappeared between February and April 2020. More than a year later, a troubling pattern emerged. Connecticut's recovery, if you could call it that, is trailing the country's as a whole. Today, we have the country's highest unemployment rate. And as our authors are going to explain, there's a reason to be concerned that things aren't going to improve anytime soon. Earlier this year, Yankee Institute set out to identify a single policy change that would go the furthest to break Connecticut out of the economic doldrums and help overcome the obstacles to growth that Hartford was inflicting even before COVID. The result was our latest report, Growing from Zero. The authors, Girardin and Dr. Daniel Gressel, are joining us today to talk about why they undertook this project, what they found, and why their proposal to eliminate the state corporate income tax is the best short-term change Connecticut can make to turn our economy around. Ken Girardin is Yankee Institute's Director of Policy and Research. Dr. Daniel Gressel, aside from the distinction of being Yankee's board director emeritus, of course, is a Chicago-trained economist. He's had a long career sharing great ideas around the world. Daniel earned his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, where his professors included Dr. Milton Friedman. He helped author Indonesia's 1980s tax reforms and advised the Chilean government on its privatized social security system. He later worked for GT Management in Hong Kong and San Francisco before founding Telios Management, a Connecticut-based hedge fund. And we appreciate both of our authors being here today. And gentlemen, take it away.
Thank you, Carol. Just to give everyone an overview of what we're going to cover this morning, first and foremost, we're going to look at the state's jobs picture. And we're going to see that we have a crisis unfolding in front of us. We're in the very early days of a sustained period of high unemployment, and that's the reason why Yankee undertook this project. Then we're going to give you some background on the corporation business tax, why we zeroed in on it as something to repeal, why we think repeal would help the state of Connecticut, and then about halfway through, we're going to turn stuff over and open up the floor for discussion with everyone. So, but here's where things stood as of June. We had about 94,000 jobs, private sector jobs, still missing from February 2020 levels. This is after the lockdown, which had momentarily made roughly 270,000 jobs disappear. We have the highest unemployment rate in the US. We are tied with New Mexico as of June with 7.9%. Looking locally, this data gets a little noisier, but you can see some really troubling spots. Hartford, as a metro, has one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. And then we've got the 7 other cities where unemployment is over 7%. These are, like I said, these are the early days of a crisis. So now the conventional wisdom when we talk about the jobs picture in Connecticut has historically that, well, Connecticut takes a little longer to recover from recessions. That's what we saw after 91. That's what we saw after the 2001 recession. That's what we saw after the Great Recession. Connecticut taking a long time. What I want to show you on this chart is this area right here. And this area is the period of time in which the national economy was essentially running on jet fuel. And Connecticut was not adding any private sector jobs. In fact, between 2017 and the start of 2020, Connecticut added effectively 0 private sector jobs. Zooming in on those last 3 years of the national economic expansion, you can see that we had great job growth happening nationally and effectively 0 in Connecticut. That's extremely, extremely concerning, because what it means is that going back to normal, it means going back to a no growth picture. And coming out of the depths of the COVID job losses, we see the US economy is adding jobs at twice the rate as Connecticut, which means essentially that Connecticut's recovery has already started to level off, and we're heading back to that pre-COVID stagnation. So compounding on this, we have other disruptions happening. For instance, you have CVS and Raytheon both saying that they're looking to corporate-wide reduce their office footprints by about 1/4. When you're looking at all 50 states as options for cutting office space, the state with the most hostile business climate, or one of the most hostile business climate, is a pretty attractive place to start dialing back your presence. And what we found is that given that we are returning to a no growth situation, given that we are still, we haven't yet hit rock bottom essentially with the economy in Connecticut, we need a radical policy change. So Daniel and I zeroed in on the corporation business tax. This is a tax that honestly has kind of operated in the background. It's over a century old. It doesn't bring in a terrible amount of money in the grand scheme of things. But the interesting thing is that it almost universally affects profitable companies that otherwise would be expanding and creating jobs if they weren't paying the state of Connecticut. So the interesting thing, we drilled into the history, and really the most interesting thing I found was that it originated in 1915, more than 20 years before Connecticut had, or more than 30 years rather, before Connecticut had a sales tax. And it was a very familiar story. It was the state of Connecticut had been on a spending bender, and the General Assembly needed to plug a budget gap, which in today's dollars would be roughly $250 million. They needed to plug a budget gap, and they zeroed in on manufacturers. And the reason being was the state grangers, the farmers, they were at the time one of the major political constituencies, wanted to get rid of the state property tax. The state at the time, in the first half of the 20th century, was financing state government by essentially sending a bill to all the local governments and making them pay as a function of their grand lists. And the farmers desperately wanted to get rid of that and really, and have the manufacturers pick it up with a 2% tax on what they called at the time corporate excess. So the corporate business tax comes online back in 1915. It reaches its current form in 1935. And then over the years, you had successive governors facing the choice of imposing a personal income tax and hiking the corporate tax. Well, they repeatedly chose to hike the corporate tax. So you had Ella Grasso, you had Bill O'Neill hiking it up. And it peaked in 1991 when the state was getting roughly 15% of its revenue from the corporate tax. Now, 1991, people will remember, was the year that Connecticut imposed its personal income tax. Connecticut, by summer 1991, was dead broke. We were billions of dollars in the red. And part of Governor Weiker's move to impose a personal income tax involved dialing back the corporate tax. And Governor Weiker made some really prescient remarks at the time about how we couldn't treat business as a limitless well, as the state of Connecticut had through the 1980s, where they'd been hiking the corporate tax just to avoid having to impose an income tax. So Weiker and Rowland both cut the corporation business tax. And the part of the interesting thing about it is they really, really, really brought down our reliance on it. So like I said, it was almost 15% when Weiker came in. Under the cuts that Rowland had overseen, it was down to about 4%. It fell even further because in the 2001 recession, because one of the problems with taxing corporate profits is that when you're in an economic downturn, there's typically less profit to tax. So at one point, Connecticut was almost all the way there off the corporate tax in terms of potentially being able to let it go forever. But instead, you had a number of governors, Rowland, Rell, Malloy, all ticking up the corporate tax at different times. Governor Lamont hasn't increased the corporate tax, but he's continuing a hike that was put in place by Governor Malloy. So he's essentially getting to spend it without having to be the bad guy who imposed it. Looking at the past 5 years, the average we've gotten from the corporation business tax is $834 million, which is not tremendous money in the grand scheme of things. Compare that to the $9 billion we get from the personal income tax and roughly $3.5 billion in sales tax revenue. So how does this affect businesses? The corporation business tax is calculated one of three ways. Either it's 7.5% of your corporate income less your expenses, so essentially a 7.5% tax on profits, a 0.31% tax on your capital base. Interesting thing about this is it really hits startups very hard. You can have startups in Connecticut that aren't yet profitable. They have no profits to tax, but the state of Connecticut still wants to go and take a piece. And then you also have a $250 minimum tax. For the largest businesses, like I said, there was the surcharge that was pushed through by Governor Rell and then tweaked by Governor Malloy, and that continues today. It's a 10% surcharge on the largest businesses. There are also many credits and exemptions. And at this point here, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to start easing my way into the case for eliminating this whole tax, because one of the problems with those many credits and exemptions is they are crafted to benefit the biggest businesses. The smallest businesses in Connecticut that pay the CBT don't get to benefit from these from this. I don't want to call it largesse. I also don't want to call it corporate welfare, but it's closer to corporate welfare. So looking at who pays the corporation business tax, this is a table that's in the report. I want to commend your attention to two groups. Here at the bottom, you have more than a third of the filers. They're paying anywhere from $250 to $25,000. These are smaller businesses. A lot of them are hanging on by their fingernails post-COVID. These are companies that the state of Connecticut could help marginally by reducing their tax burden. This group up here are the more well-established companies where any cuts on the margin are going to get reinvested in one form or another. So these are the places where you could direct money and through tax relief and know that it is going to go back into the economy. This is in stark contrast with the state's current approach, which is to basically play venture capitalist and throw money at new projects and hope they stick. So like I was saying before, the tax credit regime is really lopsided. So looking at the biggest filers, they pay only about 75% of their statutory tax bill, whereas because they can take advantage of research and development credits, they can take advantage of apprenticeship credits, they can take advantage of energy credits, they can take advantage of all sorts of things, many of which were written specifically to benefit specific companies. And the smaller businesses don't have that same kind of advantage. So they are by and large paying full freight. So we already have, if you will, a progressive argument for getting rid of this tax in its current form. Now, here's another really interesting thing about the current situation. It's not just who's paying, it's who's not paying at all. The state of Connecticut since 1997 has exempted S corporations. These are your LLCs, your more closely held entities that are paying federal taxes under Section S of the federal code. They're exempted entirely. Certain manufacturers for alternative energy, for certain turbine manufacturing, they're exempted. And insurance companies are exempted entirely because the state of Connecticut recognizes that we're taxing insurance policies separately. So we can get the money elsewhere. So the case for repeal, and I apologize, we had a little glitch with the PowerPoint. First and foremost, there's a one-time opportunity as the economy is reshuffling post-COVID, where you have companies looking to move to smaller spaces, they're reevaluating where they're going to be geographically. We have a chance to peel people in and bring them across state lines, especially when you look at the people who are paying much higher corporate tax rates in New Jersey and Westchester County. There's also in the background with all of this, the quality of life issues that are going on in New York City. If the state of Connecticut can do something to radically make our economy more attractive for corporate entities, we can kind of kickstart the kind of corporate migration that we saw in the 1970s and 1980s, when Stamford went from pretty suddenly had the third highest concentration of Fortune 500 headquarters in the country. It was almost tied with Chicago at one point. So, and like I said before, with the smaller companies, this would be something that would help these smaller companies hold on by their fingernails and preserve those jobs that are there now. In terms of downstream benefits, one thing I want to mention is that power plants in Connecticut pay the corporation business tax. That includes Millstone Nuclear Power Plant. Millstone Nuclear Power Plant is currently getting heavily subsidized to keep it profitable. Their corporation business tax in a given year is something in the neighborhood of $4 or $5 million just for Millstone. So if you were to eliminate the corporation business tax, the state of Connecticut could actually dial back the subsidy that ratepayers are paying. And then on the wholesale electrical market, if you could lower the cost of generating in Connecticut, that's going to benefit ratepayers too. And it's going to push down electricity prices. So at this point, I'd like to kick it over to my co-author, Dr. Daniel Gressel. Daniel?
Hey, Ken, thanks a lot. You did a great job. I want everyone to know Ken does all the work. So he did all the writing, and he and I collaborated on both the idea and its ramifications. The reason I like this idea is it is the cheapest way to send the strongest signal to the entire country that Connecticut is open for business. And instead of stagnating, decaying, and collapsing, we actually would like to grow and become a great state again. By that, a great place to raise a family, to have a business, and to live one's life. And this is all possible in Connecticut. It's just very frustrating for me, and I'm sure for most of the people watching, to see where Connecticut is relative to where it could be. So after having looked at all the taxes in Connecticut for many years, including the wonderful little chart that Yankee does at the 200 lowest, smallest taxes that only raise like $20 million, eliminating those would be very easy. I was asking the question, what is the one single thing we could do to just supercharge Connecticut's growth rate so people will want to set up a business here? And that's how I hit on this. And then I brought it to Ken, and he said, let's write it up. And he did most of the work. So, with that, I think we're open for questions, and fire away.
Yeah, if folks could please fire their questions into the Q&A feature, we'll be happily chip down the list. I know one question that we had going into this was, and I have my take on this, and I know Daniel, you have your take on this. Why not plow that? If we were going to cut $830 million from the state budget and plow it into tax relief, why would we go for the corporation business tax and not the personal income tax first? Well, and Daniel, you take the first stab.
Yeah, so I'll take a shot at that one. And I think the answer is that you really couldn't cut the personal income tax that much, and the signal wouldn't be that strong. Let's assume from what the numbers you just said, that the corporate income tax is 834 million and the personal is around 9 billion. So, I mean, maybe I can knock off 0.4, 0.3, something like that across the board on the rates. And while it would send a signal, it's not nearly as strong a signal as I've gotten the corporate income tax eliminated. There's something that's a little complicated I didn't want to bring up, which is also one could reincorporate one's S Corp and LLC as a C corporation and thereby get rid of, to some extent, the personal income tax. Didn't want to bring that up, but I did. And so it will have an effect on that for those people for whom that makes sense. But I just think you'll get more bang for your buck on the corporate side. Plus, typically the corporate income tax is a tax on capital, and capital is extremely easily moved. So capital will go running from one place to another, searching for the lowest cost of doing business. People don't move as easily. Obviously, the very rich in Connecticut are moving and are leaving the state, but on average, people tend to stay where they were born or raised or want to be. But corporations are much more willing to move based on costs.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add on there. You covered everything. We've got a question coming in. If we were to eliminate the corporate business tax, wouldn't the state just rely more heavily on higher income or higher property taxes? So I want to break that question apart a little bit first. We were looking with this paper to address the jobs crisis with a policy change. Right now, we have an undeterminate hundreds of millions of dollars in let's call it what it is, corporate welfare going out the door every year, where we have tax credits, we have loans, we have grants, we have government funded trainings, we have all sorts of gimmicks going out the door, and they're not working. And we were looking to say, if we could reprogram that money, recognizing that it's not going to cover the entire $830 million that we need to finance this cut, but if we were going to replace that with something, what would we replace it with? And we would definitely get more bang for our buck if we moved over to the corporation business tax and cut that instead. Like Daniel was saying, you get the signaling effect that goes with it. You get the benefit for the economy where you are cutting not just somebody's state corporate income tax bill, but also cutting their compliance costs. One of the problems with dealing with a state corporate income tax separate and apart from a federal corporate income tax is the rules are completely different. So you essentially have to pay nearly double in your compliance costs because you have state depreciation rules, state deduction rules, the state credits that we mentioned that people are still having to spend money to chase after. So you're looking at it just as something to help the jobs picture. The CBT is going to be our best bet. One other thing is that if you take away one of Hartford's levers or knobs for bringing in money, you're going to force spending restraint. So on the one hand, the question was, is it going to drive up your reliance on income tax and property tax? To look back at what one of the drivers has been behind our recent tax increases, it wasn't just, hey, we're going to raise these taxes and then go spend the money. It's, hey, we were counting on these taxes. They didn't deliver, and we had to go and scrape up money somewhere else. And that's where people got hit with taxes. You take away a volatile thing like the corporation business tax, and I'd make the argument that you're going to be in a safer position from income tax increases down the line. Daniel?
It's also the case that if you don't have any spending increases for 1 year, you approximately pay for it. That's a first order effect. Alternatively, you could look at what happens to our growth rate, and you'll discover that we will grow faster, and that in turn will cause an increase in personal sales and property taxes without a change in the rates. So while the percentage gain from the personal income tax would clearly go up with this going to zero, it's the case that could easily finance itself through faster economic growth, which I did a back of the envelope calculation. I said it was going to take 2 to 3 years from the additional growth we would get to pay for the change. Likewise, you could also just stop spending that $800 million, which is easy in this budget that we have, and that would also pay for it. So it'll get paid for both, either by slower spending or by faster growth, especially if you're willing to look out 2 or 3 years to let the growth occur.
And that was without you cutting economic development spending either. Looking at that, and also not dipping into our reserves. Right now, our budget reserve fund is at its statutory limit. It's at 15%. And we have about $1.8 billion going into it over the next biennium. But because we're at the statutory cap, that money is just going to roll over automatically into pensions. We can schedule another hour-long conversation about pensions without getting too far into it here. But one question here, does Connecticut impose any tax on LLCs or S corporations? Right now, if you're an S corporation in Connecticut, your earnings are treated, are taxed as personal income. That is to say, when you file your personal income tax return, you get, I believe it's form K1 for the feds. The K1 shows the amount of profit from that entity that is attributable to you. If you're a sole proprietor, then it's 100%, but it's commensurate to your ownership, and you pay personal income tax. One of the benefits is the compliance costs. You're not going through and dealing with the rigmarole of dealing with the corporate tax code. Daniel?
There is one little thing that goes on right now. After the federal tax, the most recent change to federal taxes, we introduced a pass-through entity tax, which basically causes the entity, which would be the S corporation or the LLC, to pay what you would be paying as a personal income tax in order to make it deductible from that entity's taxable income, which would then show up in the K1. And then the state credits that money back. I know this is complicated, but essentially that those LLCs and S corporations are paying something which I think is fully creditable, isn't it, Ken?
No, it was. I think it was meant to be fully creditable, and
Yes.
it just got notched down a little bit because something about Hartford finding a new revenue source. So I believe it's about 87.5% credible right now, if not 92% credible. But if I could shamelessly plug, in our last report on the personal income tax revenue ratchet, we explain the mechanics of the pass-through entity tax.
But it is that, so to correctly answer the question, there is actually net a tax on pass-through entities, which is about 13% of what you would pay as in personally. So if I've done my arithmetic correct, the 1.7%.
If you choose, I believe it's optional. I'd have to go back and double check. I believe the pass-through entity tax is an optional vehicle for businesses. I'm not positive about it because the idea is it's a benefit that Connecticut offers businesses in order to reduce your federal liability because of the way that you can deduct the pass-through entity tax on the business side, whereas there's a $10,000 cap on your taxes on how much of your state and local taxes can be deducted on your personal income tax return. So I'd have to double check. I believe it was voluntary. I know other states that implemented it did it on a voluntary basis. Well, we'd have to go see. I also see we may have a corporate tax attorney lurking on this call. So, and based on the question, I want to apologize for any bread that I'm trying to take out of children's mouths right now. But the question is, have we considered doing what California did about 10 years ago to modify their corporate income tax apportionment rules to only apportion corporate income to Connecticut based on the sales made by companies in the state, that is by eliminating payroll and property as factors? Interesting thing, Connecticut did something like that. It was roughly 10 years ago. We went towards so essentially, when you have companies with presence in multiple states to try to figure out what their liability should be in different states, historically speaking, Connecticut used a three-legged formula where you looked at the payroll they had there, how much property they owned there, and how much of their sales was there. And you had different weightings depending on the type of company. Connecticut did away with that, and Connecticut does solely apportion the CBT liability based on how much of sales are in a state. Now, we didn't go into this more, but one interesting thing about getting rid of the corporation business tax is we'd be able to steal a little bit of the state of Delaware's thunder. The state of Delaware, part of the reason they have the financial presence that they do from these companies is because they tax things. They abstain from taxing certain things. The single biggest thing they abstain from taxing is sales of intangible property. And people might have heard the story, it was kind of scandalous a few years ago, where Toys R Us was essentially licensing Jeffrey the giraffe as intellectual property to its stores in the other 49 states. And then those stores were paying the state of Delaware. And then Jeffrey LLC was not paying any corporate tax on those funds, whereas those profits otherwise would have been hit by corporate business taxes in 47 out of 49 states. That goes to the idea that post-COVID, where we have this retrenching happening, and you have so much remote work happening, and people are wondering, where should my small headquarters be? Connecticut could be extremely attractive because of all the things that historically made the state great. It's a great place to live. We've got a good airport. We're close to New York City. We've got beaches. I'm not going to turn this into a gubernatorial tourism ad, but there are lots of fundamentals here that we have that South Dakota doesn't have, that Wyoming doesn't have. Those are the two states that don't have corporate business taxes. And
just to say what Ken said again, I want to reiterate one point. So because of the allocation rules that all the states have, were you to eliminate the corporate income tax here, meaning there's no allocation, you would discover that lots of companies that are in multi-states who aren't here would sit there and say, if I set up my headquarters, or if I set up some kind of a sales office or something in Connecticut, I could end up reducing all my other state taxes because of however it plays out for that particular company, those allocation rules. So you're actually making a point, the question is making the point that getting rid of it, and given that all these other states have complicated allocation rules, is such that we would end up attracting companies just so they could come and start to play whatever kind of games corporations like to play in their tax department.
And I just read the rest of the question. The observation, California made this change to discourage large tech companies from moving to other states, and it was successful until COVID hit. That's interesting. I need to look more into that. Speaking of other states, I didn't mention this before, but the real pioneer on this stuff has been North Carolina. North Carolina has dialed back their corporate business tax in the past decade from 6% to 2.5%, and they have a pretty serious contingent in their legislature that wants to go all the way. So Connecticut has the chance to do this first and really capitalize, or we run the risk of having North Carolina get there first and really steal this one opportunity that we have to have a breakout strategy. Now, one other question that we got had to do with how would want to get the, looking at my own notes here too. It's how would the elimination of the CBT affect Connecticut energy costs? So like I was saying before, Millstone Nuclear Power Plant gets subsidized. Essentially, the utilities in Connecticut are forced to buy a certain amount of their power from Millstone at an inflated cost, essentially to keep Millstone in the black. Because that's handled by state regulators, and given the rules around what happens when a utility's corporate taxes are changed, we saw this after the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in 2017, the state regulators would be completely within the right to go in and renegotiate these tariffs, these different rules related to the forced purchases from Millstone, and shave Millstone's savings off those forced purchases. And the result would be lower utility costs for everyone in Connecticut. Separately speaking, we get our electricity on the wholesale market. There are essentially auctions every 5 minutes. This is more of an indirect effect, but if you cut the corporate business tax, you essentially reduce the break-even price that companies need to bid into the system to bring up our, to win the auctions and be the one that delivers that marginal megawatt of power. Carol, you look like you had a question.
After all these months, still mastering the wonder that is Zoom. No, I was just popping back in to signal that we are coming up on the half-hour mark, Ken.
Gotcha. In that case, I'd encourage anyone else who has questions to fire them in there. Daniel, what jumped out the most at you while we were doing this report?
Well, for me, the interesting part was the history that there's the political science part of the farmers getting together to put a corporation income tax on. That was just fun as a history lesson. I personally had always known that the corporation income tax in Connecticut was riddled with exemptions and credits and all sorts of ways of politicians doing what they like to do best, which is put on a tax, and then give exemptions to everyone in order to get benefits. So one of the things by getting rid of it you'll do is you'll take away that incentive and that ability to go and play the game politicians like to play, which is to give a benefit to a favored few at the expense of the many. So that was striking. I also was a little struck by the difference in and how those credits landed, meaning that the credits actually were going to the rich, what a surprise, and not going to the poor, what a surprise. So that's kind of like accord with most political science theories right now, is you have the concerned big companies who have the money to lobby and the money to influence government, and then you have the mass of people who aren't able to do that. And so if you have a little bit of a populist bone in your body, when the inevitable statement comes, oh, you only care about the rich and you don't care about the poor. Well, the answer is we could see it in the credits and the effective rates that actually we could throw that argument right back at you, sir. And it turns out that all you care about is the rich and you don't care about the poor, or as they like to say, the thieving rich as opposed to the deserving poor. So that for me was a bit of a surprise. Not surprise. I mean, political science forecast. The scene in black and white was always, the cynic in you always win. You would prefer to have your naive thing, your naive hope for humanity win once in a while, but it turns out it rarely does. So.
Daniel, unfortunately, your class warfare dog whistles caused some problems at Carol's homestead.
Okay.
We got a few questions coming in. To what extent is Connecticut's huge debt discouraging businesses from expanding in Connecticut? That's a really good question. That's extremely difficult to measure. I would say this. One of the secondary benefits of this report is that the best defense is a good offense. Part of the reason why we've drilled so hard into the personal income tax, and part of the reason why we've drilled so hard into the corporation business tax, is to essentially increase the political price and decrease the political economy of going further down that path, because those are the two things that businesses are worried about happening. More universally, there are plenty of other problems. In terms of the debt, it hasn't come up in conversations, but one thing I have found in my conversations with Connecticut business owners is there is always there's the observation of something bad that's happening in Hartford. And then there is and if they go this much further, I'm cooked. Like, this could destroy my business model. This will be what breaks me. And it's, when you add all these things together, it goes way beyond what Hartford could ever do in 1 year, but together it has this tremendous chilling effect. The fact that there is this thing on the horizon. So it goes back to Daniel's point in terms of the signaling effect. If you were to go and have an administration and a legislature that stood up and said, we have a jobs problem, we don't care who the top line beneficiaries are going to be of this tax change, we know it's going to help working people get jobs. If you have that kind of mentality in government, I think that would send a tremendous signal to folks who are on the fence about investing here and say, okay, we have some adults in the room, they recognize the situation. And that spills over to dealing with the debt picture too.
And one other thing, I mean, if you get economic growth, typically these debt pictures always get less bad. So if I grew at 5% in the state real, and you started to calculate out stuff, you'd end up saying, well, we don't really have a debt problem as long as they hold spending down. I mean, you could always create a debt problem by spending, but it's been my experience, having worked in Chile, Indonesia, Costa Rica, that when you have a big ugly mess that's out there, inevitably it gets itself solved one way or another. Typically in Latin America, it got solved by inflation and the mess disappeared through an inflationary blow off, which is a totally different topic, which might be happening soon at our federal level. But we're not going to bring that up right now. Anyway, so I think economic growth will, caused by the corporate income tax elimination, would tend to alleviate part of that debt burden. Obviously, if they're only worried about the debt burden, I would find it difficult we wouldn't have the growth. Likewise, I think most corporations are going to look at what they're paying in tax now, and the bird in the hand is worth two in the bush kind of thing. So if they're paying zero tax now, they'll worry about what happens to them later because they could always move again. So 25 years from now, the unfunded liability causes a tax increase. Well, they'll deal with it 25 years from now.
All right.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I had a question.
Sure.
Go ahead. No.
Just to avoid the allegory, but we are really in a situation in Connecticut where people are fighting over smaller slices of a stagnant pie, rather than showing any interest in growing the pie. I know it sounds like such a gross oversimplification, but Connecticut really is becoming the textbook example for the 50 states of a place where you have, led by the public sector unions and their enablers in Hartford, people who are more interested in just fighting over what share of the pie they're getting than paying any attention to the size of the pie in the first place. Carol?
Well, just to pop in, my apologies, our puppy decided to defend the house from intruders, apparently. How long do you all estimate, a reform like this would actually take to start having beneficial effects, aside from, of course, the signaling effect?
Immediately. Immediately. Partially because all these businesses pay more through the quarterly withholdings process than they actually owe. As a standard, it's something they overpay by something like 20%. So looking at this as the net of $834 million, you would instantly in Q1, let's say the General Assembly, ate their Wheaties, got on this in January 2023 or sooner, and instantly and made the cuts, you could instantly inject an extra $300 million into the state economy, like right then and there.
Likewise, studies at the federal level show that, and international, show that a cut in the corporate income tax to fully get reflected in the capital stock of the country, we're not talking the state, to fully get reflected in the capital stock of the country take 10 years. So I would argue that for a state where you're really trying to just switch things around, it could go more rapidly, but that would be the outside estimate, would be 10 years. You would see it right away. You would see it right away in electricity prices. Ken just walked you through how that would happen, which would lower your cost of production. So I would think you would get, it'll take 10 years and you just kind of do some kind of a scale. You get most the first year or most the second year probably, and then it declines and it's all done for sure by 10 years.
And by the way, we're already seeing a little tiny taste of what kind of migration could be possible. You'll notice Governor Lamont announced 3 corporate relocations into Connecticut over the past year, or over the past month and a half. One thing he hasn't mentioned is that all 3 of these businesses are fleeing recent corporate tax hikes in New York. In downstate, you have not only do you have the state of New York's corporate franchise tax, but you also have a surcharge that varies by the year to fund the MTA. And New York City puts a separate levy on businesses. So Governor Lamont shows really good manners, and he doesn't go stick it in in New York's eyes when this happens. But you're already seeing companies that are that are reacting to what's happening on their side of the border. And we could really turn that up to 10. I mean, really make this place a headquarters sink that just sucks things in from Westchester, from New York City, from Springfield, to a lesser extent from Rhode Island. It really is a transformational opportunity.
GE would move back.
Well, we could certainly give it the old college try. And I see we have a question about have we worked with legislators to propose this? And that's something, of course, the first step is getting this idea out there and helping legislators see the merit of doing something like this. And Yankee's legislative outreach, that's part of what our job is to help legislators, even those who would not normally be oriented toward a pro-business policy, understand that it isn't simply for business. And that's sometimes where I think there is a disconnect with some of our friends on the left. Things that are pro-business aren't simply pro-business, they're really pro-people, because what are businesses but jobs and people and prosperity for everyone, top to bottom? That's my 2 cents. Gentlemen, feel free to continue for another 4 minutes or so before we have to wrap this up.
We had a question come in about whether we've identified the 10 biggest corporate taxpayers. We can start to make some inferences. The state gave us zip code level data, but only for zip codes that had at least 10 filers. And you can start to make some inferences. Part of the reason why we have a general sense of what Millstone nuclear power plant plays is because we had Waterford, or I think it's Waterford or Black Point data that gave us a pretty good idea of where we assumed most of that was Millstone. But otherwise, it's hard to say. One really surprising thing, especially with GE on paper in many years posts multi-billion-dollar losses, at least in their, at the national level. It's not clear how they attribute that among the states, but you very often have major corporations that play the credits. They know, they have an army of tax lawyers, and they're able to get away with paying $250 for the year. And it's the smaller folks who often remained C corps. They didn't become S corps in the 90s. They remained C corps partially because of the federal depreciation rules made it more beneficial to be C corps than S corps, or other small technicalities unique to their circumstances. But they're the ones paying full freight. They're the ones just filling out the returns saying credits. I don't do any research and development. I'm a mechanic in Ansonia. I can't take advantage of all these things that were developed for Pratt and Whitney or all these other companies that Connecticut has held onto by its fingernails. And the problem is that the General Assembly just isn't good enough at it. The General Assembly cannot bribe everyone often enough as responsively enough to get a growth situation here. And I just want to direct everyone's attention back to that slide. It's in the report. But you had the last 3 years of a massive economic expansion in which Connecticut added absolutely 0 private sector jobs. That is what we're headed back to. That is why I don't expect us to recover to pre-COVID employment levels before 2024. It's a really stark indictment of our business climate, and it's something we need to be taking apart with a blowtorch. Corporate business tax is the first thing. There's probably about 24 or 30 policy changes we chase after right then and there. But this is a really, really serious situation. So if I leave folks with one thing today, it's that we have a big problem in Connecticut. It was a severe pre-existing condition, and it's not going to go away.
Daniel, what final words of wisdom do you have to shower us with like the gentle rains from heaven?
I second the motion on Canada. it's so frustrating to watch a state that should be so good do so poorly. And one of the things we do at Yankee is we propose changes to make things work better. And this is, in my opinion, one of the best ones to come down the pike. And obviously, because I'm involved, I say that. I think it's also true. So it's one of the best things that Yankees come up with is a single policy that could do more to jumpstart the economy at the lowest possible fiscal cost.
And we are grateful to everyone for joining us today. At Yankee Institute, one of the things that we are committed to doing is empowering people here in Connecticut to forge a brighter future. And we all can do that. We can do it together by making sure we take ideas like this and drive the action that's necessary to help them become realities. We are grateful for your partnership in making that happen. We're grateful for your time today and for all that you do for us. So thank you so much for joining us. And of course, Dr. Daniel Gressel and Ken Girardin, all of us at Yankee Institute for this discussion on Yankee's new study, Growing from Zero.